But I met Kieran a few years ago. He was doing a talk at a conference in Glasgow, and he was speaking particularly about a project that he completed on the bats of Kasanka. And over the years, I've just followed his career and got to know him, and we just sort of chat through ideas and these processes. So for our first show and the event for Nomas projects, we wanted to begin with something that fitted the values and aims that we have, but which was also of a high calibre, and Kieran was an obvious choice. Kieran's a photographer specialising in long-form essays. I might let him explain that. His work crosses the pictorial genres of landscape, portrait and still life in the realist tradition. He's trained as a photojournalist. His images seek to understand specific contemporary issues which connect to deeper themes in his wider body of reportage, the beauty of the world and the suffering that pervades it. The work he'll talk about today was funded by a Winston Churchill Travel Fellowship and undertaken over 2 months in China's Qinghai province. Have I said that right? Qinghai, thank you. During 2012. His photography has won national and international awards from the World Press Photo and UK and Ireland's Picture Editors Guild, with publications in the New York Times, National Geographic and Geo, among others. The most recent work, Displaced People, is taken from a series, Third Pole. He has exhibited this series already in Glasgow University and will also be exhibiting in the Scottish Parliament in the summer of this year. That's if summer ever comes. The exhibition Displaced People employs a landscape approach to the subject of human incident during economic and social upheaval. The photographs document China's highland clearances of modern Tibetan nomads. The work considers how cultural identity rooted in the environment is reshaped by the necessity of nomadic resettlement. So we're extremely thankful that Kieran was willing to take the risk with us, just in our first effort, and to enable us to begin Nomas projects with quality. So I'm confident that what you're about to see and hear will inspire and challenge you creatively, and so with great pleasure, I introduce you to Kieran Dodds. Thank you.
Just to tell you, this mic has no amplification properties, it's just for the video. So if you can't hear me, just shout, speak up. Great, Kelly, thanks so much. Thanks for coming on this cool day. Feels very Tibetan, actually, I thought when I was coming in. So Kelly's kind of done a good intro there. Basically, my work in general considers the role of the environment on human culture and society. So that's the sort of bigger story. And I'm just going to start off by kind of introducing you to my work over the last decade, briefly doing that, and then on to this story in particular. And there'll be time at the end. I mean, it should just be about half an hour, and then time for questions and maybe answers, if I can. So let's consider my sort of general work. I've been based in Scotland for 10 years, travelling around the world from here. And I started in Aberdeen after reading zoology up there. And then I moved to Glasgow and worked in kind of editorial at the Herald newspaper group. And it's during this time I've really been interested in the national identity as a Scot travelling all around the country, just seeing the diversity of us as a people and trying to work out where on earth that comes from. And so I've been doing works, before that even, the thing that underpins all my work is this belief that the universe is made up of stories and not of atoms. Obviously, when I was doing zoology, you're studying the scientific worldview, and I still believe in atoms, don't get me wrong. But it's just this idea there's narrative throughout all things. This storytelling is in everything. There's stories everywhere. So that really underpins my career and everything I'll talk about. So this idea of identity and culture rooted in the land. I've been doing a series on the Highland Games in Scotland, very much a cultural expression, which we, as Scots, I suppose, kind of frown on and think it's for tourists. But actually, it rises from the land. It's tracing the memory of past society in Scotland, in the farming, in the forestry, in the sports, and the clan system. So I'm quite interested in trying to trace the memory of past society. Also interested in how environment affects us. I might skip over that as there's kids present. Environment affects human beings and how an urban environment affects us. It's not just rural affairs, but also how we affect the environment, and not just negatively. Often we see it as a negative thing, mankind's influence on the environment, but we do ridiculous things like build beautiful bridges, like the Forth Bridge. And this is very much trying to tell the human story of the Forth Bridge, it's just part of the landscape now, but it was made by people and it was maintained by people. So I was quite intrigued at how that all works together for good. It's just been quite interesting reflecting on this, the role of the environment and human culture, and how we influence the environment. And my first photo story, long-form essay, was in Malawi when I can't remember the year, it's too long ago. When I was doing zoology, it was my dissertation project studying blue monkeys in Malawi on this mountain. And when I was there, I spent more time taking photographs and trying to convey and communicate what I was seeing, thinking of the people back home. And it really was interesting seeing what it was in humans that makes us exploit the environment negatively, and also how we restrain that impulse. Because in zoology and conservation, it's all about putting up fences and keeping humans out. But we've got this kind of ideal utopian image of man and nature coexisting. So I was just intrigued how our myth of this coexistence and sustainability is at odds with the reality of exploitation. And so it's my desire to know and understand. My work is rooted in the belief that there are answers, and if we gather evidence, we can get answers to questions. But it's also, these answers often give rise to even more questions, which takes more investigation. It's a very, very much scientific approach. Have a hypothesis, look at the evidence, and then try and tell the story from that. After the Evening Times, skip a few years, I did my kind of apprenticeship there as a junior photographer. And during that time, I got a bursary and travelled to Africa to do this story on fruit bats, the total antithesis of life in Glasgow. I think it was a reaction to urban living. But I went out there and I wanted to deal with a species which is negatively portrayed in our society, certainly. Even Batman can't do much to help the bats, even though Batman's good. It was his fear of bats that made him Batman. So bats are probably the least approachable mammal in our society. And in zoology and conservation, it's always about focusing on the fluffy creatures, like the pandas and the lions. And if we protect them, we protect the creepy crawlies, the stick insects, and such like. So I want to consider the benefits and the beauty of such species as bats. And it was intriguing to be out there. But it's also interesting because these animals, although we look at them as not particularly beautiful and not very helpful to us, they're the things that are seeding the rainforests in Africa and are vital to the future of the planet's lungs. So incredibly valuable species. But the interesting thing is they then destroy the trees they're roosting in while at the same time spreading the forests. So it's this idea of flux in the environment. So it's quite interesting when you look into these things, trying to see what we actually value in nature. What is it we ascribe a value to? Is it their functional role, the utility role, or is it because they look nice and fluffy, like pandas? I then returned to Zambia a few years later. It's one of these phrases, a cliche, that you leave your heart somewhere. And this was literally true for David Livingstone, whose heart was buried just next to this lake in Bangweulu. When he was on his last adventure, he succumbed to a fever and died, and then they buried his heart and then brought back his body from Africa. And I was intrigued to see how Livingstone's legacy endures today in conservation, pioneering conservation, where they're employing commerce ideas to empower local people to then restrain the exploitation of the environment. It's kind of a carrot and a stick. It takes them away from exploiting the fishery by giving them livelihoods. So I went out there, and I'm always interested in the kind of grassroots level, what people there are looking for, what they're interested in, what they value in nature. Is it purely utility they need to feed, or are they trying to get something more? So I'm always interested in the human aspect to conservation and how the environment is affecting that culture and identity. Also doing the other aspect of conservation is the politics of that country. In places like Zimbabwe, which had so much wildlife, it's hard to start conserving when the whole country is in disarray. And so I went there during the time of the cholera outbreak, considering if there is beauty in suffering, which is for another day. But now we come to the work for today, which is displaced people in the third pole. And for me, the idea of nomadic people resonates deeply within me. And I think in human society, it's this idea of freedom and wildness. It links back to our kind of ancestral past, people roaming the land. And I like this idea that we kind of admire that and value it somehow. Whether that's a good value or not, we can think about in the next wee bit. But this is an incredibly important part of the world. It's the Tibetan Plateau they call the third pole, and it affects 40% of the world's population. It's hugely influential. It's almost more influential than the North and South Pole because of the proximity of human beings to it. It lies, it's this kind of crusty, scabby area just there where India rams into China. And all of it pretty much lies within China. I was interested in particular in Qinghai province, this red zone, which is where I traveled for 2 months last summer. I blew my effects budget on this slide, here we go. So, I was getting bored putting it together. It's got 40,000 glaciers, as it says there. It's warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. So it's incredibly important and valuable to human life, and yet is under threat. And so to try and tell this massive story, how do you go about that in photographs? I wondered. And I kind of applied for the Churchill Fellowship with this idea. I'd met Mark, who I'll speak about later, and he had sort of made me think I want to go to this place or go back because I'd been nearby. And I wrote the application. I got shortlisted, got the interview, and eventually they were convinced I could do it. And then I thought, let's see if we can do this. How do you capture such a big story out there? And Sanjian Yuan means the Three Rivers headwaters. I thought, you can't do it all, let's focus in. So we focused on this small area between the two roads, the Three Rivers headwaters, which is the size of England and Wales. It's very small relative to the plateau. And you can see 7 rivers flowing off the plateau here. So we're concerned with the Yellow, the Yangtze, and the Mekong. The Yellow and the Yangtze being the 2 main arteries in China's industrial heartland. So the economy of China depends on these headwaters to conserve them. So how I went about planning it was to kind of write chapter headings. When I was reading, I'd write chapter headings of how I saw the story progressing. And I had a number of these headings. And so for the first one, the third pole, a vast landscape in the roof of the world, source of life for 500 million, it's actually 600 million, people downstream. And then for each of these headers, as I read research and popular press articles and spoke to people, I then constructed locations. Where are these places? And actually, it was just on the ground. You've got this in your mind. It's a hypothesis. You're looking for certain pictures. And as you go along, if it isn't a vast landscape in the roof of the world, you change what you see. Or you find a landscape that isn't on there. So that wasn't on there. Anamachi Snow Mountain. And so this picture really sets the scene about this vast landscape on the roof of the world. And also of this lifestyle, the Tibetan nomads, whose lifestyle is now becoming rarer and rarer. It's becoming endangered. And it's really central to the life of Tibetans and the culture of Tibetans to herd yak. Yak herding is so central. It was the yak that allowed people to colonize the plateau. It was their dung, in fact, which they could dry and use as fire, that allowed people to colonize this place. So Tibetan culture arises from the yak. And today they're looking to the yak to sustain that culture. So it's rooted in the land. And it's this is the curve of the Yangtze River. Still quite far from the source, but it's massive. And you can see the yak is important for meat hanging up there drying, for the tent made from yak hair, the milk, the butter they put in your tea, which is pretty rancid, and just various things. It's so important, everything. It's a very important animal for that. And in this part of the world, the story is often squared as the Tibetans being oppressed by the Chinese, and it's very superficial level. What we hear in the press. It's very biased and polarized. And I was intrigued to see what was going on there, what was it like on the ground, and see what was true in that and what actually wasn't helpful. But the traditions are strong still. The culture of the Tibetans is very strong. So this is a kind of pop-up horse race one day in the plains. We just saw some horses. Suddenly all these vans appeared, and they created this, I think, 4 hours of horse racing. It was incredible. And tradition is very strong for these people. To be a nomad doesn't mean you're doesn't mean you're regressive in any sense. You're modern as a nomad. You use a motorbike to get to your tent. You've got a smartphone out in the sticks. One of the most remote places in the world I've ever been. I got there, days of travel, and actually the best phone signal I'd experienced. I had data. I was checking my email. We didn't have electricity, but I had some battery power. So you can still have modern technology and be nomadic. You can still move around, looking after your herd. So these two things are not mutually exclusive, being modern and being a nomad in that. So what affects China affects the world. So what is affecting China up here? The rangeland, this vast plateau, is under threat. And there's three main things that were pointed to as causes. Firstly, climate change. The grassland turning to desert caused by climate change. And the way to solve that is for the authorities to change the climate. So they're firing rockets, seeding the clouds with planes. Very grand schemes. Secondly, little pika, burrowing rodents. So they were burrowing as they do, and because of that, that was seen to be a threat, and so they were eradicated by mass poisoning. And the third thing was Tibetan nomads overgrazing the land with their yak. And so the solution to that was to resettle, to take people off the land, to improve the pasture, removing people from the land. And the local people noticed the climate is changing. Things were not as they always had been. It might be in part due to what was happening just next to the plateau. If you're pumping out all this pollution, that must have some impact, which surely is something to deal with. But the movement of the nomads is probably the most controversial from a human rights aspect. And I was interested to see what was being done to the people, and also how this affects the culture, how it affects individuals in that. But in displacement, just as with clearances in Scotland or movements of people, displacement is not just pushing people off. There's also a pool. So the pool of education, the pool of healthcare draws people as well. So this is children lining up doing the military drills as they do before school. There's nothing sinister particularly in that. They're just at school getting some discipline. But getting moved off the rangeland because they have to move to the cities because that's where the big schools are now. And the big stat from 2009 was that over 500,000 nomadic people will be moved off from Qinghai by the end of next year. And that is a massive amount. It's not all of them, but it's a fundamental redefinition of the culture. If it is rooted in the environment and they're taken off that environment, that's going to have a severe impact. And we're seeing glimpses of that already. But it's part of a bigger worldview. It's part of a communist ideal that it is better to be modern and urban than it is to be rural and herding. Farming is more noble than herding. So it's part of a bigger story. It's the enclosing of the land. The land is being improved by being enclosed, which for anyone with a knowledge of history in Scotland, even a simple one, sounds very familiar. We're trying to close off the land. And that does something in us as well. We come to that thinking that can't be right, because this idea of freedom, unhindered freedom, is being constrained. But whether that's true or not, we can discuss later. And it's also quite hard, once people have been moved, to try and get back. They've given up their herd, and they're stuck in a sense there, or they're quite comfortable there. So it just varies. Like this chap, I thought this quote would be straight out of a Chinese paper actually. I like the government, I miss nothing, it's perfect. I never went to school, but I hope my children may go to university one day. The thing is, I do actually believe this man because he had a job. But in these resettlement villages, often 70% of people don't have jobs. And there's a great loss of dignity, a loss of identity, even culture shock for those who can't speak Mandarin. But he had a job, he had a nice family, he had a nice house. And I found out later that was a model village that they took officials to see. So I was like, that's why it looked so nice. But it's good to have that balance as well. And education, of course, something we see as good and important to give to people to help them get on. But there's limitations. You can see on the door in the background, the plastic on the door. This was like a building site. Only one room in the school wasn't chaotic because the teacher was very good at controlling the class. So it's a work in progress, like the new society being forged outside. It is a building site, and there's problems that come with that. But it's a good pool, education. But then once you're in the towns and cities as a child, it's exciting. You can play with your friends. You can get Steve Jobs jumpers. I love Steve Jobs. Or Apple caps, or iPods, or an iPoo. I saw that was the best typo when I was away, an iPoo. So they get involved in urban living and don't want to go back. It's a very hard life to be a nomad. Why would you want to go back and do that when you can live comfortably? So you can see it's a draw into the cities and towns. So the teacher says, compulsory education will ruin our culture. This is a man who's very committed to education and who's come back to a smaller town to educate because he sees the benefit from that. Healthcare as well, very basic in the rural areas. But again, there's work to be done there to try and improve the rural healthcare. People don't necessarily have to move into towns to get good rural healthcare. There just needs to be a better approach. And also, I suppose, propaganda, whether it's from the Tibetans themselves or elsewhere, or, the bigger world. Nomads have started thinking the grass is greener in the city. The city is a place of opportunity to go. This is Yushu, which was destroyed by an earthquake in 2010, I think. And it's been rebuilt by the authorities. And it's been rebuilt around two totems of Tibetan culture. So in the middle there, you've got this horse, King Gisar, a mythic king, who symbolizes the freedom and identity of the people. And on the hillside, the monastery as well, this massive monastery getting rebuilt by the Chinese authorities. Two twin totems of Tibetan culture. And people are drawn to these places. And it'll be a sort of eco-city, it's been called. So rebuilt by the Chinese. Mm-hmm. But this is out on the plains, smaller villages having these resettlement towns next to them, the rows of houses there, shoulder to shoulder. Very depressing looking places. And if you're unemployed in that as well, it can be very demoralizing for the people. So there's huge societal problems there that need to be dealt with. Especially because the Tibetans are people of the land. The culture is rooted in the land. Before Buddhism, it's animistic worship, so kind of spirits in animals, in the land, in the water, in the mountains. It's kind of worshipping different deities. So it's a very, very much a culture that's come from the landscape. And today, this strange juxtaposition of the tiger, it was always fake. It was never real. And people getting their photo taken next to it. You know, there's this desire to be at the land and to be connected to that. As she says, these lifestyles are endangered. And I really, when I was there, wanted to, I suppose, document things before they change, document things as they change, and to show how these changes in the environment affect the culture. And very much I wanted to square the whole argument, this polarized debate of Tibet and China, in the context of the environment. It arises from the environment. So to understand the story fully, we need to understand the issues in the environment. We're always having to go to China for not looking after the environment. And so it's quite interesting when they do a massive scale that obviously it's criticised. So how do we try and work with them or work to benefit humans and the environment? I was intrigued by that. And it's a time of transition. So on the surface, it looks, as you kind of expect from the movies and the things you've seen of that area, but there's something not quite as you expect. And it's in these kind of anomalies, like in science, the anomaly often gives rise to the facts of the matter. It kind of reveals something you wouldn't have expected before. So there's this kind of strange identity shift going on as society changes, as the outside comes in, so to speak, as people get TV and smartphones, and it's very modern in many respects. But there's also the social issues. So we're progressing in some respects, but actually the society can struggle. So in this case, the girl has come into town to do school, and the parents, to remain as herders, have sent the grandparents in to look after the kids. So it's childcare. But the grandparents are bored. They've got nothing to do. They don't have their friends to speak to, and they just get bored. And also this woman was terribly disabled because her hip had dislocated, and she's just dealing with that. We're able, actually, with the work of the NGO, to help her quite remarkably. A very simple thing, just changed her life. Herding is the only sustainable use of the lands. And this really would be the saving grace of nomadic lifestyle. It's sustainable. It has a utility function. And it really gets back to the question of what is the value of a culture? What is the value of people and of the environment? And if it's a utility one, that resonates with a government that wants to look after its resource. And you can understand it. They've got this incredible resource which is supporting millions of people downstream. They have to look after. But can that be done in a way that's slightly more subtle and not just clearing everyone off? And actually, it needs to involve the herders as well, because they're best placed to save the snow leopards and the wild yak and things out in the environment. So this gentleman, a dog, actually, the nomads have these terrifying dogs in the landscape. It's like a walk in Scotland, but there's terrifying dogs everywhere, chained up usually or roaming around like huge bears. And how terrifying, it actually killed the snow leopard, one of the nomads' dogs. And so this nomad could be one of the people in future who's there to look after the animals. They are out in the environment. I suppose that's what I'm trying to show in this picture. It's the proximity of the nomad to the environment, to very rare species such as this. They're best placed to look after it. And this is a wild yak with its weedy domestic cousin on the right. Look how puny he looks. He's submitting to him. And even behind him, actually, there's a wee female. So this wild yak had come into a domestic herd, obviously looking for a pal to mate with. And though they are inconvenient to the nomads, wild yak have actually been known to kill nomads because they're so testosteroned up to the max. But it shows the proximity of people to the environment. And actually, the wild yak bring genes and vigor to the herds. But also, now it is the wildlife that throws a lifeline again to the culture. The culture that arose from dependence on the wildlife, now, once again, if it must survive, will depend on the wildlife. So there's a way for it to endure. Whether it means it should endure or if it's got value in its own right is another question. I suppose I'm looking at it from a utility point of view here, and maybe you can discuss that. But it's this interaction of man and the environment. Can we live sustainably in that? No culture is a museum piece. There's quite a few in here, actually. In a museum, there's lots of cultures, but they're kind of frozen in time, aren't they? Snapshots of what culture is like. But it's kind of fluid. It changes over time. There's no need to be nostalgic for a pastime. Whether a culture survives depends on the people. It depends on people seeing it as valuable to keep it. They want to sustain it because it's valuable. So the Tibetan culture will change. That's just natural. But whether that's a good or bad thing, I'll work up to you. It's always good to finish with a sunset. At the source of the Yellow River, these dried out riverbeds and lake beds have actually refilled in recent years. The Chinese press point to the rockets and the planes seeding the clouds to have accomplished this. But whether it is and whether it will be long term is another question. Just a quick word about the guys I was with. Plateau Perspective. Go on their website if you've never heard of them. They do amazing work, and they're managing to allow nomads to survive and live off the land, and also work with the authorities to do things that benefit them. So it's kind of working, doing incredible work out there. On the left we have Hilton and Timothy, Kaz, my wife, and me. Those two guys were the sort of translators, tour guides in general, laugh on the road. And Marion and Alistair and Mark sort of set up Plateau Perspectives. And that's their camper van, which gets some incredible looks when you're out in the sticks. A camper van out there. I felt adventurous until I sat in there with 10-year-old Alistair and watched Bear Grylls. And then I just thought, I'm not really a real adventurer here, am I? Life on the road, at its best, was like this, camping next to glaciers. Quite a lot of time though, you're in really scabby little hotels. You have to sign in and out with the local police so they can track where you are. So actually I prefer to be outside camping in the grass far better. The roads, again, you can't avoid the roads. It's like driving in a pothole for about 800 kilometers. I prefer driving in rivers or riverbeds. They're quite small at that time of year, just because it's smoother. But it was like, I was thinking this the other day. It's like those power plates you get at the gym now. Have you seen them? Where you hold on and you shake for about like 3 minutes and you become like Schwarzenegger. It's kind of like that. Obviously, it doesn't have lasting effects, but it's just incredible endurance skills out there. So I'll leave it on that now. That nice picture to finish. Maybe if you've got some questions, you want to. It's a big topic, and I realise I can only do so much in a limited time. But I'm happy to answer any questions if I'm able. Yeah. And Winston Churchill, if you're British and alive, then you can apply for this. That's the only two criteria. And basically just come up with an idea that will benefit your life in some way and the life of people you're going to see. And they will actually fund your trip. So I'd recommend everybody does that if you're British. Cool. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Kieran. It's great just to, that's the first time I've really heard that presented like that, because usually when we've been chatting, I'm getting wee snippets here and there, so that was excellent, really informative for me as well. Yeah, we've got till 3:30 actually. The McManus closes at 4, so we need to be finished by 3:30 just to get tidied up in here. So there's plenty of time for questions. I know it sometimes takes time to formulate a question, but if anyone has one already in mind, and if not, we're happy just for a bit of silence till we formulate one. And Kieran, if you would mind just repeating the question for the
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The culture is being repressed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what did I see? We hear a lot about the culture being oppressed. So what did I actually see on the ground? I suppose there's as much interference there as in all of China in terms of the government interfering with life. So there's always restrictions compared to here. There has been particular intense restriction in some parts because of self-immolations in recent days, linked to some monasteries. And so obviously the authorities have come in and come down hard on places there. But actually there was places as well where there was a sense of some kind of freedom. Pictures of the Dalai Lama up in the monasteries. It's not to say they're free, but in China, it's all relative, isn't it? But I suppose what I wanted to do is to try and, like this, see whether people are being oppressed constantly, or whether people can get on, whether they can get an education and go off and do things. And I suppose actually the biggest hindrance, in a sense, is the lack of work. And so it just leads to despondency. So it's more, I wonder if it's, because you could say it is like a Chinese authority. They're saying, let us do this, let's break the culture, let's break the society. But I wonder sometimes if it's just like, it's a worldview difference. So they think, actually, we're benefiting the people, we're modernizing them, they're coming into towns, great. They might not quite get it just now, but we're actually doing them a benefit. And so it's trying to get into that mindset, actually, they don't necessarily mean to do wrong. There are good Chinese people in the government, and there's some Tibetans in the government who are not doing the best for the people. So it's trying to get away from, it's just trying to see it a bit more complex, That's a bit of a ramble. Yeah.
You talked a lot about people moving out of the nomadic environment into the towns, and you mentioned that it was key that the reverse started happening. Are they seeing that happening, and what's the drawback? How's that been created?
Great, good question. So what people are being drawn into the settlements are people going back, if that needs to be done. Yes, and interestingly, the authorities actually have stumped up the cash to pay for 10,000 keepers of the grassland in November, just after it came back. So the government are sort of officializing the value of nomads. They're saying nomads are valuable, and we're going to pay them to stay on the land and to conserve wildlife, and to look after it, which is quite unexpected. You're like, oh, that's great. So that's 10,000, but it's a start. So that, a draw, I suppose, is giving them money to stay out there. And we'll see how that works out. It needs that kind of incentive. Also cooperatives, trying to encourage cooperatives so people can actually stay on it's economically viable. Or ecotourism, so people can stay on the land and it's economically viable, because they need to be able to sort of make a living. So there is a draw, or maybe it's not a drawback, but it's allowing people to remain on it, trying to stop the flood down into the cities. Yeah. Is that helpful? Cool. Yeah.
What about the effect of people moving off the land, or the impact on their culture? Did you see evidence of, I don't know, kinship breakdown or alcohol problem, or people, kind of manifestation of the changes you're looking at?
Yeah, so what was visible in terms of cultural breakdown from moving into the cities or towns? Because a lot of these settlements are quite neat, a few thousand people. Yes, there was alcoholism and violence and breakdown in that. Yeah, so that is all well researched and can be seen. In fact, there's a sociologist, Chinese sociologist, who was totally up for resettlement. And over his research, speaking to people, listening to them, seeing what was on the ground, he's kind of turned himself around 180 degrees and thinks, actually, this isn't working, it's not helpful. So it's tangible, it's there very much. And in some senses, it reminds me of parts of Scotland, where there's this kind of people moving in, they don't have employment or a hope of that. They get some kind of welfare, and then they just perhaps feel despondent and don't have the ability to push themselves on. And depression as well is a big problem. Yeah.
You've got some wonderfully intimate portraits of people and their lifestyles. I'm wondering whether people were universally sort of receptive to your presence.
Aye.
As you work hard at that, or potentially where you felt intrusive.
Yeah. So did I feel intrusive at times, or were people generally accepting of me? I think, they loved it. Yeah, I'd say that. I think the Tibetan people were incredibly warm, actually, to us as outsiders. I think we were quite a novelty, especially having a blonde wife as well. But I just felt very welcomed, and I got on with them well. So I don't think there's many times. And also, as a photographer, you don't just blast in there, guns blazing and like move people around. So as long as I respected them, that they were very warm. And actually, yeah, you always had to have a cup of tea with people. So, yeah, not necessarily a good thing. But yeah, you'd have a cup of tea, you'd just chat with people through the translators. And yeah, they were very, very warm, kind people, generally. Was there any time where it's the dogs I had issues with?
And partly because there weren't many other tourists.
Yeah.
So
Not many tourists there as well, yeah.
compared to Zambia as well.
Yeah, so Banguelu, where Livingston died, the folks there just did not. It was one of the few places in the world actually where people have been actively like against us. No matter what you did, they were just wanting money and wanting stuff for pictures. Whereas most places it's been all right. But Tibetans were great. Yeah, quite an earthy sense of humour. Quite Scottish actually. Yeah.
In areas where the Tibetans had moved into towns or cities or that, was there an integration with Chinese community, or was there a separation between the two?
Yeah. Okay. So there's integration if people moved into cities and towns with Chinese people. I mean, these areas, the settlements, are in sort of Tibetan majority places. So I think there's interaction in a business sense. But in the far regions, there'd be very few Chinese. And some of them get on, but some of them actually face, threats and abuse from the Tibetans. So if the Chinese are coming in, they get that. So I wouldn't say it's harmonious. No, particularly. And actually, in the big cities, all the reconstruction work and all the roads getting built, huge. It's just like a building site, massive city. And it's Chinese migrant workers brought in, so Han Chinese brought in. And that can lead to resentment because they're not doing that. So, yeah, the harmonious society, which is talked about a lot, needs a bit of work, certainly. There is that. Mm-hmm.
How did it work practically, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah.
I'm guessing you're using digital cameras and
Mm-hmm.
electricity and so on. What was it like from that point of view?
Yeah, electricity and digital cameras. So I had a few batteries with me. That was useful. But actually, most places had electricity at some point. Yeah, is that true? Yeah, pretty much. But we had a generator in one place. Other places it's in a city. So you just, whenever the electricity was on, you just plug in everything. Drain half the city. So there's electricity in most places, yeah. There's only a couple of places that is solar power, and so you can charge at night or something. But actually, that was one of my concerns going there. You just run out of power, and you're done for. But actually, they're pretty good. Yeah.
Someone's been touched on, we're interested in the idea of how projects, particularly kind of inquiry and research projects, connect with local communities. One thing that strikes me about this is you've chosen an artistic medium to communicate. And I suppose, beyond the question of how did the community respond, did they engage with your artistic practice? I'm thinking about, you've got some really striking images. How were the community able to see, or the community of people able to kind of engage with that, appreciate it, benefit from it? Was there, or was it a medium that seemed irrelevant, or?
Yeah. So in terms of how did they engage with the artistic medium, me taking the photographs and them seeing the work? Right. Yes. Okay. How would it benefit from them? I suppose in a practical sense, people seemed to get what I was doing. So when I said I was, taking photographs to then tell the story elsewhere, they were very supportive and up for it. And also, I think they understood, like photography now, everyone has got a camera. And so I think there was a kind of transaction there, even if you didn't understand, they come up with their camera phone, in your face, and you kind of laugh about it. And that was a way in, actually, often, taking the photographs. So maybe not express the exchanging artistic ideas in that way. Yeah. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it was
something on it.
Whether there was almost a dialogue opening up
Right.
around.
I suppose the dialogue, speaking to them about the issues informed my work, certainly. I would always speak to people and hear what they had to say. And if I'd come in with some idea of what was happening and they said something different, I would always try and sort of work that in. Yeah.
That's what I wanted to ask you as well. Like in terms of your research, before you went, you would have an idea of how you were going to approach it. Did that change when you were there?
did it change when I was there, my approach? Yes, it did. So I'd realised some things that I thought over here would be a great picture, visually strong. I actually started to realise they weren't that big in the story. Oh, hello. Does that tell me I've got to talk at the McManus? That's helpful. So, what on earth was I saying? Yeah, so how did things change? So like, I might have read about mining, for example, in that region. A lot of big mines around these mountains. A lot of areas being tested for mining potential for lots of gold. And actually, when I got there, it might not have looked like anything as well. It's hard to convey that. And actually, in this story, I wanted to be specific, and I think the bigger issue is the environment, how the environment affects the people coming off the land. So in a sense, I thought that's important, how mining is affecting the environment, but actually it's kind of a bit player in the whole drama. So that affected what I would shoot when I was out there. Yeah. I'm trying to think of other examples. Yeah.
You had given your proposal to Churchill,
Yeah.
Churchill thing as well. Were they, well, two questions, were they content with what you came up with in the end? And was that also a big pressure on you the whole time you were there?
Right. Yeah, so the pressure of the expectations of the Churchill people. I think the biggest pressure on me was me. So my expectation that I needed to make this work, because I'd invested a lot of time reading up on it months before, which was unpaid. And so I thought, actually, you need to, you want to make sure you produce a work that does it justice. So I had that pressure on me. The Churchill folk are incredibly low maintenance, actually. Just recorded. They require a report from you to say what you did, and I'm speaking at the Fellows annual general meeting like next month. It's not compulsory. So they were actually very low maintenance, yeah. So I didn't really feel pressure from that. I felt more concerned I wouldn't do it justice. It's such a vast landscape, and I wouldn't get things that capture it. And in terms of the proposal to the Churchill people, it was the general story. So I didn't have to give them all the sort of chapter headings. It was, I'm going to document the land, the wildlife, and the people of this Three Rivers headwaters and how they are being affected and changed. So it was quite vague, actually. Yeah, it's quite good.
What was your purpose in doing the shoot? What are you hoping to get out of it?
Yeah.
Where are you hoping to present it or have it published?
Yeah. So what's my hope with the work in terms of its outcomes? So personally, again, the Churchill people ask what your motivation is. And for me, it was to try and use my academic training as a zoologist and to produce a work which requires research, to fuse that with my photojournalistic career, in a sense of personal development, growing as a storyteller. In terms of outlets, very much editorial. So it was published in Hong Kong in a magazine there. So it's kind of disseminating, communicating the story there to try and make people understand. So in Hong Kong, it was just published in La Repubblica in Italy a couple of weeks ago. Geo in France are publishing it. And so just, it's getting it out into the world. And then as Cully said, exhibition in the Scottish Parliament, and then this as well. So just basically trying to disseminate the information as much as possible, so that the hope that people be interested in the work there, maybe get involved or support worthy NGOs such as Plateau Perspectives. So yeah, there's lots of different things in it. Yeah, is that helpful? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, cost you, but.
As a photographer and kind of in the photography world, how do you get past, or what's the theory behind shifting from, particularly as a Western photographer, in other countries? How do you approach your research and your practice on the ground so that you're not exotifying
Yeah.
another?
Mm-hmm.
Because I noticed in some of your pictures you were showing like a lot of the complexity of the issues,
Mm-hmm.
which I think does get past just kind of an us and them
Mm-hmm.
perspective.
Yeah.
I wonder, in theory, as a photographer, kind of how would you
How to mitigate for that?
your
Yeah.
position?
So how do I? So you're saying how do I prevent a kind of us and them portrayal of it? How do I? in my research mitigate against?
I guess in storytelling as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I suppose, do I do it consciously? Yeah, I'm sure. Like, if you look, a Chinese photographer doing this might do it quite differently. And actually, I looked at a lot of other photographers who'd done this, and most were Western, and most were like basically showing people in miserable conditions, looking miserable. And so, in a sense, I wanted to convey what the local people felt of the land as well. They love the land. They're proud of their environment. They love, the Tibetans are very proud of their environment. So I had to think about that. But I suppose just listening to what people are saying and trying to I'll be aware of my bias. I kind of know my biases. And so try to be aware of that and stop myself just going, oh, there's a monk with a funny hat. But actually to see, there's part of that. And partly you've just got to be true to what you're like. I'll take photos of things I'm intrigued by because I'm intrigued about them. I want to communicate that. If I take a photo of something which I'm not intrigued about, it makes for really dull pictures. So there's naturally going to be bias. This is not objective fact and truth, just in case you're, it's not the whole story. But I've tried my best through research and speaking to people and knowing my own biases to come up with a work that is true to the place. Yeah, that's helpful. And the third question? Yes, yeah.
Has migration of nomads into the cities had an effect on the welfare of women in Tibet?
That's an interesting question. Has the migration of nomads had an effect on women? Well, in terms of liberation or otherwise? I suppose a short answer is, I don't know, actually. Yeah, I don't know if I'd be informed enough to answer that. That's quite particular. I'd be interested. Maybe that's my next trip. Yeah. Sorry, I can't really think. I'll think about that. Yeah. Any other easier questions? Is there anyone? Yeah, hi again. That one. The girls to be educated. Okay. Stay with the parents to look after the animals. The girl, I think it's just that family had a girl. I don't think it's not a bias, because the schools are a fairly equal mix, actually. Where's that other one of them all marching? And it's compulsory for boys and girls. There you go. So, yeah, so it's not the girls stay back there. So they are getting an opportunity to. And whether that, it's an interesting discussion about actually how Tibetan Buddhism portrays the role of women and the value of women and children, actually. And as that power structure, how that affects the vulnerable of society. And again, I'm not going to comment because I don't have enough information, but there's something in that worth exploring, which actually we don't get to that because we're too transfixed on like, boo, China, yay, Tibet. It's a political level. And I suppose comes back to that idea. I'm kind of pro-people, pro-Tibetan, pro-Chinese. I'm like, it's trying to get into the human story. And there's too many of them to know everything. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
The Chinese authorities sort of give any sort of indication of the long-term plans for those new communities,
Mm-hmm.
the new towns that they're creating, in terms of being able to sort of generate employment
Right.
for the Tibetans. Do they have any?
For the long-term plans for income generation. I think, yeah, so in the remote places, ecotourism is a potential earner for sort of the remote communities. In terms of the towns, commerce, mining, construction, just making stuff. So they would be future outcomes. But also, in terms of actually giving away what they're doing, I think it's quite hard to assess. Because the official rule is, we're resettling, that's good. But actually there was sort of a sense behind closed doors that high up in the government, they didn't think it was working and they've got to change it. But actually they're not going to put that in the press, are they? So in terms of knowing for sure, I suppose on the ground they're always talking about communities and cooperatives, that's what's being said in the press. Whether that comes to fruition is a different question. But certainly there's potential for rural economies to flourish, yeah. But whether it's the Tibetans themselves just have to take the opportunity, with help, perhaps, mentoring from NGOs or other companies. Yeah.
The family that you showed who moved into town with the grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that there'd been physical problems and
Yeah.
the NGO had done things to alleviate that, but you didn't allude to what they were.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. So what did the NGO do? So the NGO actually, they do environmental conservation, but also healthcare work. So Marion's a doctor, Mark's a biologist. So they do various projects. And they have occupational therapists, and they have a little centre they just opened up after the earthquake to help people rehabilitate. So they've got OT and rehabilitation. So this woman, the dislocated hip, I think the simplest thing was just getting sticks so she could get to the toilet. The problem was getting to the toilet. The husband, this very frail man himself, had to carry her to the long drop in the courtyard. So getting her sticks to get up and then giving them a wheelchair to wheel her had a huge impact. Something like that, which actually doesn't cost much. It just needs someone with expertise and the time to do it. So I think that was the main thing. And then encouraging them to go use the sort of authority hospitals to get a hip replacement, which could be done 4 hours away if you wanted. Yep. So just trying to encourage that. There's also no, I won't talk about that. Okay, yeah. Yes?
What did you say that you were going to do on your visa? Did you just say you were going to be a photographer?
Yeah. So I think it was a visitor visa. Yeah, as a photographer. Yeah.
Did your pictures have to get reviewed or anything, or did they not worry about it?
No, just my wife. She checks them. Yeah, no. Did my pictures get reviewed or anything? No, there's nothing, no interference like that. Yeah, once you get the visa, you're in. You kind of left your own devices pretty much. Yeah. You have to be sensible. You don't go about like people's faces or whatever. Yeah.
Just very quickly,
Yeah.
all through the documentary, or however you want to phrase it, the overlaps for me with some of the community building or community redevelopment that's going on in our own city in Scotland. The overlaps were just there, left, right, and centre. And I'm wondering, have you, I'm sure there are photographers documenting that in this country, and I'm not suggesting for 1 minute they're the same, but there are lots of questions. And even that question made me think, I wonder if a similar project was going on here, whether Dundee City Council would want to authorise that or would want to see it authorised. Have you connected with that, or I don't mean as a project, just personally, have you connected with that?
The work going on in cities, helping communities rebuild.
Where there's, for example, there's various communities in Dundee that have become problematic and people have been moved out and into other
displaced.
My practice background is in social work, so that's where this comes from. But I see these things happen, and again for some of the same ideals about regeneration, and the same problems come with it: loss of work, loss of relationships, despondency. And I suppose it's just questions: have you connected with that more localised displacement activity?
In Scotland, I suppose over the years I've done stories, especially living in Glasgow. Just you can't avoid the displacement in Glasgow and the social issues, and so I've always tried to do stories linked to that. So the drug addiction one was a specific one, but there's 2 stories I'm embarking on which link in to this. So the Scotland Effect, the bigger social and health story of Scotland. So I'm sort of starting on that, which will involve going into communities, meeting people and hearing what's happening here, and also looking into the historic lowland clearances as well. That's my next. I'm hoping to collaborate with a uni on that, to just look at how there's so many link-ups here. You're right. This is kind of a contemporary picture of what's happened in the past in Scotland as economic progress affects communities. And so I'm more interested in trying to investigate that in Scotland long term. It's always been an issue that I've been kind of commission-based a lot in the last couple of years, and kind of with this was a first sort of chance to go deeper for longer. So I hope to do more in Scotland with that, yeah, definitely, if there's an opportunity. Yeah, love to.